So all of these Aboriginal people that were put in the missions, it was outlawed for us to speak our languages, practice our songs, dances, culture, storytelling, all of that. It was outlawed. It was illegal for us to do that. Then we had to learn about the Bible and learn about how, English and all of that. So that's how we started getting European education from the Christians. Okay, so once we were able to speak and communicate and know what work is about, then we were farmed off to cattle stations. Okay, so it was all under the native welfare portfolio. Okay, so when you think about it, Christians were allocated land to build missions. Okay, but in turn, the missions educated the indigenous people to be slave labor, to building up cattle stations, farms, townships, etc. Okay, so we became the property of either cattle stations or the farms. And we used to be allocated what they call a dog tag. It was a tag that you carried, and that showed the native welfare that you was registered as a property of someone. That's how it was back in the day. We didn't have rights. Okay, if you look at Australian history, this was terra nullius. It's still practiced today as terra nullius, uninhabited land. So thereby, the colonizers regarded us as subhumans. So thereby, we didn't have any rights. Okay. So now that young Aboriginal people are working out in the cattle stations, the young ladies are now becoming pregnant and they're having children, but all these children are now light-skinned Aboriginal. The policy, it was white Australia only. It was illegal for non-Indigenous people to have relationships with Indigenous. So thereby now all of these young light-skinned kids are born. Native welfare comes around, they collect all these kids and say, oh, you can't have this kid here. So they remove the child, light-skinned child, from the Aboriginal parent. They say, oh, you can't have this. So now what happens to this kid is, this kid gets taken over and is fostered out to adopted homes. So now all of these kids are sent off to these cities and adopted by these non-Indigenous people. And then, curiosity, people start questioning, well, where does this kid come from? That's not European. That's a light-skinned Aboriginal. So now people are starting to question what exactly is happening to the Indigenous people. Because they only got told by the governments what is happening. You know, the government tends to paint a good picture about what they're doing. But the truth was, they wasn't. They were having all these kids. So who was getting punished for having all these kids? Aboriginal mother and the Aboriginal children. They were being punished. They were being taken away. But the mother would stay there and still continue to have kids. Go figure. But anyway, all of this happens now. And a lot of people are questioning, well, where will these half-caste kids come from all of a sudden? So now the government has to come clean. They start talking about all of these kids. It's illegal for Aboriginal people to have white kids and all of that stuff. That's why the kids are removed. So we still don't have any rights. 67 comes around. 67 was the fourth, I think, or the third referendum that was passed through. Right now they're asking for a referendum for the voice. Back in 67, there was a referendum to give Aboriginal people basic human rights. Okay. So 67, the third referendum was actually passed. Majority of white Australia voted that Aboriginal people should be given basic human rights. So our history as basic humans started from 67 in Australian history. Okay. So now 67 rocks around, what happens up here? Doesn't kick into play up here until 1970. Okay, 1970 up here, a lot of the pastoral stations now started removing Aboriginal people off the lands, locking the gate because they didn't want to pay Aboriginal people basic human rights, a basic ward wage. How do we get paid prior to that? Flour, sugar and tea. It's materials. That's how we were paid. So we were basically slave labor. When we received our basic human rights, we were removed from the cattle stations because Pastoral didn't want to pay us award wage. So the dilemma is now, where do we go? Can't go back to the land because the pastoral's got our land. We can't go back to the missions because the missions are closed now because we've got basic human rights. So where do we go? Townships. So overnight there's a population expansion blown out of proportion. Kununurra, Wyndham, Halls Creek have all of these Aboriginal people that they call fringe dwellers living on the outskirts of town. Native welfare policy comes in. Native welfare comes in. What do we have to do with them? Well, we can't give them award wage, so we'll introduce welfare benefits. So welfare benefits is introduced. Then they set up reserves. Okay, the reserves are still here today. You look at Miramar, you look at Garden Area, you look at Naliwa. Those are reserves allocated to Aboriginal people on a 99-year lease.